Well, Cuba, it's been a while, and people kind of no longer have Ukraine on the brain. I blame this on the hyper politicized nature of the way many of us consume media. But what has been the NATO G8 EU response to not just the current war in the Ukraine with Russia, but also the refugee crisis as well?
Well, on refugees, there's been more than 3 million Ukrainians that fled the country, 2 million through Poland. And the European Union, one of the stereotypes in the transatlantic relationship is that the US is daddy, the EU is mommy. That's where you go if you want your free healthcare. That's where you go if you want your social spending. And that, in this case, mommy stepped up and Ukrainian refugees. And just to give a sense, the 2015 refugee crisis was a little over 1 million Middle Eastern refugees coming in. And it was a big adjustment and a um, difficult to absorb that full wave. Right now, in a much shorter time frame, it's been 3 times as large. Uh, I think that the crisis mentality and the fact that this is a neighboring country and the picture of Putin as a villain helps motivate Europeans to look after incoming Ukrainians. And the types of complaints that were made about the 2015 wave are generally not applied to Ukrainian refugees. And part of that stems from difference in country of origin, complexion, religion, but also given the coverage of the invasion of Ukraine, there's almost universal sympathy for the suffering of Ukrainian people and admiration for their resistance to the Russian invasion. NATO has responded by pouring in as many weapons as it possibly can through Poland, through other NATO allies into the hands of the Ukrainians, because Russia has held back its air force from the operations in Ukraine. There's different theories about that, and I have my own. The ability to move supplies into Ukrainian hands is quite secure as long as Western Ukraine doesn't fall under threat. That's one reason why there have been some missile attacks against targets in Western Ukraine, primarily places that the Russians characterize as ammo dumps or distribution centers. But right now, the Ukrainians are not likely to run out of firepower anytime soon. Heavy weapons are a bigger problem. The plan to transfer MiG fighters from Poland, Bulgaria, Slovakia to the Ukrainian Air Force has run into American hesitancy because it would be seen as a potential escalation, and there is fear that there might be a Russian response that's unexpected and dramatic that would complicate the ability to contain the conflict. And this is really a big moment for all of the transatlantic institutions, NATO, the G8, G7, and the EU, as to what their future will be, how relevant they'll be as organizations, what the roles are to be divided up between them in the, what they like to refer to as the rule-based international order. And it's unclear to what extent the EU efforts are coordinated with NATO. Certainly, there was some embarrassment when the U.S. declined to green light the transfer of the MiG fighters. That came out without U.S. approval from the Polish side. And there might be parallel efforts that aren't entirely complementary. If a European defense and foreign policy gets established out of this, that might create more tensions between the NATO and the transatlantic institutions and ones that are based on the EU, especially now that the UK has exited and that Brexit is finished, severed its relationship with the EU under very acrimonious terms. And the UK has traditionally been America's greatest partisan inside the European Union and the greatest stumbling block, not coincidentally, to greater European integration and coordination, especially on defense and foreign policy. So those are the transatlantic institutions. The G8 is where many of the economic sanctions are being debated, because it also includes Japan as a major economy that is not a European or NATO power. And Zelensky addressed the Japanese diet remotely, using very strong terms to call on the strongest possible sanctions and the greatest possible support for Ukraine. And he he thanked Japan for its support in the conflict. The coordinating the sanctions has proven, on the one hand, everything has happened very quickly. On the other hand, the announcements seem to have been a little premature. Today, there were marathon meetings, NATO, G7, and EU in Brussels, to discuss the response to Russia. And on the German side, there was an unwillingness to sever energy trade with Russia. It simply put, Europe is too dependent on Russian gas to be able to add that to the mix of sanctions and economic constraints without some way to offset it. And while Qatar and other suppliers of liquefied natural gas have said that they're going to increase their supplies to Europe, there isn't that much give in the system for that to be a seamless transition. The Qatari LNG is already spoken for. Generally speaking, energy is sold not at a spot rate, but on large volumes through large-scale contracts. So the Qataris would have to short another customer in order to substantially increase their contribution to the EU. This might create an opportunity for American fracking. That industry took a severe hit as energy prices fell. Now that Russian supply is constrained, potentially you'll get more Pennsylvania, more North Dakota, more Texas, Oklahoma industry involved in extracting gas to be sold to Europe. But there's also been developments on the Russian side. Somebody in the chat brought up the India-Russia trade in rubles as a potential complication for the sanctions order, and indeed it is. So Russia has taken a couple of steps to try to respond to U.S. sanctions. It's requiring that energy sales be conducted in rubles. Typically before, Europeans or other foreign countries would deliver dollars or euros to a Russian bank, which would handle the conversion and keep those reserves as part of its deposits. And ultimately, that's where a significant amount of Russian foreign currency reserves, that's how they were built up. But something like $300 billion worth of those reserves were impounded at the start of the conflict, which demonstrates not only the power of the sanctions, but also the risks of trading in dollars if there's any political sensitivity. So Russia now, they'll continue to sell you oil, but you have to get the rubles yourself. which creates an international market for rubles, helps shore up their currency, and means that Western banks that deal in and Western payment systems that deal in euros and American dollars don't control the transactions. You can't sanction transactions that are occurring in rubles on the SWIFT system because the SWIFT system doesn't accommodate that. This creates a challenge for the purchasers because there aren't that many rubles out there. And the one country that has a long-standing currency relationship with Russia is India. Russia-India trade has been conducted on a ruble to rupee basis for years now. And there's derivatives, there's institutions that are specialized in this. So India may end up being the channel for getting around sanctions to trade with Russia. And that relationship is unlikely to develop further out into third country transactions. Egypt and Bulgaria aren't going to be using rubles for their trade, but as more countries from the global south look at their energy requirements and the types of commodities that they need to purchase from Russia, then you might have a deepening of financial relationships between countries in the global south and India in order to access those ruble to rupee lines without going through Western controlled currencies like the US dollar or the euro.
Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to hit like and subscribe on your way out. You can catch the live stream of This Is Revolution every Tuesday through Thursday at 6 p.m. Pacific Time and Saturday, 9 a.m. Pacific Time. This is Revolution.